Imagine walking into a drag strip in 1965 and seeing a 41 Willys coupe with its front end jacked so high the driver could barely see over the hood. The engine, a blown 427 cubic inch big block making over 600 horsepower, stuck out through a hole cut in the hood. The whole car weighed maybe 2,400 pounds. These were gassers, and they owned drag racing. Then, in a single rules meeting in late 1965, the NHRA made one decision that killed them all. By the 1966 season, the parking lots were full of abandoned gassers. The tracks that once roared with their straight axle fury fell silent. An entire class of racing that had defined the sport for over a decade vanished like it never existed. Picture Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach, California, on a Saturday night in 1964. The place is packed. 8,000 people crammed into wooden bleachers, another 1,000 standing along the chain-link fence. The air reeks of nitro, rubber, and racing fuel. But what everyone came to see were the gassers, Stone, Woods, and Cook's 41 Willys pulling the front wheels 3 feet off the ground at launch. Big John Masmanian's 41 Willys gasser running low nines at over 150 miles per hour. These weren't just race cars, they were mechanical gladiators, and every pass down the quarter mile was combat. The crowd didn't just watch, they felt every launch in their chest, tasted the tire smoke, became part of the violence. Then the NHRA changed everything with Rule 8.01, Section C, and within 6 months it was over. This is the story of how gassers went from the undisputed kings of drag racing to extinct dinosaurs in less than a year. It's about money, politics, manufacturer pressure, and a sport transforming from outlaw rebellion to corporate commodity. But mostly, it's about how progress killed one of the most visceral, dangerous, and spectacular forms of motorsport America ever created. To understand why gassers died, we need to understand why they lived. In 1951, when the NHRA was first organizing drag racing into classes, they had a problem. Hot rodders were showing up with everything from modified Model A Fords to brand-new Oldsmobile Rocket 88s. How do you create fair competition when one guy's racing a 2,800-pound car with a flathead 6 and another's got a 4,000-pound Cadillac with a 331 cubic inch V8? The answer was weight to horsepower classes. Take your car's weight, divide by the cubic inches of your engine, and that determined your class. Simple. Except hot rodders immediately figured out the hack. If you're dividing weight by cubic inches, you want the lightest car with the biggest engine. That meant pre-war coupes and sedans. 33 Willys, 37 Chevys, 41 Fords, because they were light, cheap, and you could stuff absolutely massive engines where a flathead 6 used to live. But here's where it got interesting. These old cars had terrible weight distribution to begin with. Heavy engines up front, nothing in the back. When you dropped a 400 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi that weighed 750 pounds into a car designed for a 200-pound flathead, physics got angry. The front got so heavy that racers started experiencing catastrophic wheel standing. The car would rotate backward on launch, sometimes flipping completely over. The solution was pure hot rod engineering. Jack the front end up, way up, move the center of gravity back, use straight tube axles from sprint cars because they were lighter than stock I-beams, ladder bars to control axle wrap, airplane surplus fuel tanks in the trunk for weight transfer. By 1958, what started as a safety fix had become the signature look. Gassers weren't just fast. They looked like they were about to fight somebody. The gas classes were designated AG through EG based on that weight to cubic inch formula. A gas was the unlimited class, any size engine, any modification, as long as it ran on gasoline. By 1960, A gassers were running supercharged 500 cubic inch engines, making power numbers that nobody talked about because nobody really knew. Dyno testing was for rich teams. Everyone else just kept adding more blower, more cam, more compression, until something broke, then backed off slightly. The problem NHRA faced by 1965 was that gassers had become too good at their job. They were the show. When Stone, Woods, and Cook showed up at your local track with their candy apple red Willies, nobody cared about the stock or modified production classes. Gassers were violent, unpredictable, and spectacular. They wheel stood for 100 feet. They swapped lanes mid-pass. Sometimes they crashed. Sometimes they exploded. Every run was must-watch chaos. But Detroit had a different vision. By 1964, the Big Three were fully invested in drag racing as a marketing tool. Ford had the Thunderbolt program. Chrysler was backing the Ram Chargers. GM was technically banned from racing by corporate policy, but Pontiac was cheating that ban 6 ways from Sunday. These manufacturers were spending millions developing special lightweight muscle cars, aluminum body panels, plexiglass windows, deleted heaters, and radios. The 1964 Ford Thunderbolt weighed 3,225 pounds with a 427 high-riser, making 425 horsepower from the factory, or 500 horsepower, depending on who tuned it and how honest they were being. The manufacturers had one big problem. Gassers were still faster. A well-built A-gas Willys could run mid-nines at 150 miles per hour. The best factory experimental cars were struggling to break into the 10s. Worse, from Detroit's perspective, kids weren't fantasizing about buying a new Galaxy or Plymouth. They were drooling over beat-up 41 Willys coupes in the back of Hot Rod magazine. Enter the politics. In late 1965, the NHRA held a series of closed-door meetings with representatives from Ford, Chrysler, and GM. The public was told these meetings were about safety improvements and advancing the sport. The real agenda was different. The manufacturers wanted their new muscle cars to win. They wanted kids buying new cars, not rebuilding pre-war junk. They wanted the spotlight. NHRA's solution was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. They created a new rule allowing altered wheelbase cars in a special class. Suddenly, those factory teams could move their rear axles forward 10 inches, shift the engine back 25 inches, and completely redesign the chassis while keeping the stock-appearing body. They called them funny cars because they looked funny, like somebody had grabbed a normal car and stretched it like taffy. But here's the genius part. NHRA didn't technically ban gassers, they just made them obsolete. The altered wheelbase funny cars were allowed to run the same weight-to-horsepower ratios, but with modern chassis technology, better aerodynamics, and factory backing. A gasser that ran 950 was suddenly racing against a Mercury Comet with the entire drivetrain moved forward running 8.90s. The transformation was immediate and merciless. Dick Landy's altered wheelbase 1965 Dodge Coronet, with its Hemi moved back toward the firewall and the rear axle shifted forward, ran 10.39 at 133 miles per hour right out of the box. By mid-1966, with development, these cars were running in the 8s at over 160 miles per hour. The gassers didn't stand a chance. Let me explain the technical devastation in detail. A traditional gasser was fighting physics with brute force. Take Stone, Woods, and Cook's Willys. The chassis was still fundamentally based on 1941 factory specifications, modified heavily, sure, but still using the original frame rails, cross members, and mounting points. The front straight axle, while lighter than stock, created tremendous unsprung weight. Every bump, every weight transfer, every torque reaction had to fight through solid mounting points and leaf springs designed in the 1930s. The engine placement was a compromise. You could only move it back so far before you ran out of firewall. The transmission still had to clear the floor. The drive shaft angle became extreme if you moved things too much. Most gassers ran 4-speed manual transmissions because automatics strong enough to handle 600-plus horsepower didn't exist yet in a package that would fit. That meant the driver had to shift while controlling a car that was actively trying to kill him. Miss a shift at 7,000 RPM with 14 pounds of boost, and you scattered $5,000 worth of engine across the track. The superchargers were another issue. A 6-71 GMC blower hanging off the top of a 427 big block put the carburetor air horns about 4 feet off the ground in a gasser. The air turbulence at 150 miles per hour created lift, actual aerodynamic lift, that tried to pull the front end up even more. Teams experimented with hood scoops, velocity stacks, even backward-facing carburetors to manage airflow. Nothing really worked. Now look at the funny cars. Start with a clean sheet of paper. The engine could be placed exactly where physics wanted it, 25% of the wheelbase back from the front axle. The rear axle moved forward, meant the leverage arm for acceleration was optimized. The weight distribution could be precisely calculated, 45% front, 55% rear, shifting to 25% front, 75% rear under acceleration. The bodies were acid-dipped and rebuilt with fiberglass. Where a steel door on a 65 Plymouth weighed 85 pounds, the fiberglass version weighed 15. The entire body of a funny car weighed less than just the frame of a gasser. They used chromoly tube chassis that were infinitely adjustable. Coilover shocks instead of leaf springs, automatic transmissions with trans brakes that could launch at 5,000 RPM with consistency a manual could never match. The aerodynamics were transformed. Instead of a blunt-faced 41 Willys punching a hole through the air, you had the swoopy lines of a 66 Charger or Cyclone. The engines were enclosed under lightweight hoods. The stance was level, reducing drag. Wind tunnel testing at Chrysler showed a 40% reduction in aerodynamic drag compared to a raised gasser stance. But the real killer was repeatability. A gasser was a knife fight every pass. The driver had to feather the clutch, control the wheel stand, shift at exactly the right moment, and keep it straight while the car tried to swap ends. Even the best drivers, guys like K.S. Pittman or Big John Mazmanian, could see their times vary by half a second, depending on how well they hooked up. Funny cars were consistent. The automatic transmission launched the same every time. The chassis was designed to transfer weight predictably. The aerodynamics kept them stable. Don Nicholson's flip-top Comet could run within 1/100th of a second pass after pass. That consistency meant everything in elimination racing. The death blow came at the 1966 Winter Nationals. NHRA had created the new experimental stock and funny car eliminator categories. The purses were huge, $1,000 to win versus $200 for gas class. The factory teams all entered their altered wheelbase cars. The crowds, fed by massive advertising campaigns from Detroit, came to see the new funny cars. The gassers were relegated to their own eliminator, but the writing was on the wall. Stone, Woods, and Cook, arguably the most successful gasser team in history, saw what was happening. They'd won the AGS title at the 65 Nationals. But by spring of '66, they were building a Mustang funny car. Their beloved swindler, a Willys, was parked, later sold to a collector, for less than it cost to build the engine. Ohio George Montgomery, another gasser legend, converted his 33 Willys to a full tube chassis funny car configuration by late 1966. He kept the Willys body for tradition, but everything underneath was modern. The straight axle was gone. The ladder bars were gone. The leaf springs were gone. It wasn't really a gasser anymore. It was a funny car in vintage clothing. The numbers tell the brutal truth. In 1965, there were an estimated 400 competitive gassers racing at NHRA-sanctioned events nationwide. By the end of 1967, fewer than 50 were still racing, mostly at small, non-sanctioned tracks. The major teams had all converted to funny cars or quit entirely. The fans followed the spectacle, and funny cars were more spectacular. They were faster, ran bigger engines, and by 1967 were running nitromethane fuel that created 1,000-foot header flames. The financial mathematics were devastating. A competitive gasser cost about $15,000 to build in 1965 money. That's $140,000 today. These were not rich teams. Most were 2 or 3 guys with day jobs pooling their money. When NHRA changed the rules, that $15,000 investment became worthless overnight. You couldn't convert a gasser to a funny car. The chassis was wrong, the body was wrong, everything was wrong. You had to start over. Some teams tried to keep racing in the smaller gas classes, but the crowds weren't there. Track owners booked funny cars as headliners. Sponsors wanted their names on funny cars. The magazines wanted funny car features. K.S. Pittman, who'd won multiple NHRA championships with his Chevrolet-powered 29 Ford Gasser, quit racing entirely in 1967. In an interview years later, he said, "NHRA killed us. We went from heroes to nobody in one rules change." The irony was that funny cars became even more dangerous than gassers ever were. By 1970, they were running 1/800 horsepower on nitromethane, hitting 200 miles per hour, and the bodies were lifting off at speed, causing catastrophic accidents. Don Garlits lost half his foot when a transmission exploded. Jungle Jim Lieberman died when his funny car crashed at 250 miles per hour. The safety issues NHRA claimed to be solving with the rules change were actually made worse. But the manufacturers got what they wanted. Kids were buying muscle cars. The Plymouth Cuda, Dodge Challenger, Ford Mustang, Chevrolet Camaro. Sales exploded in the late 60s, driven partly by their drag racing success. The funny cars looked like something you could buy on Monday, even if they shared nothing with the production car except the basic shape. There's another layer to this story that nobody talked about at the time: insurance. By 1965, insurance companies were getting nervous about drag racing. Too many accidents, too many lawsuits. Gassers, with their radical weight transfer and tendency to go airborne, were actuarial nightmares. NHRA's insurance costs were skyrocketing. The rules change wasn't just about pleasing Detroit, it was about staying in business. The funny car formula was actually safer on paper. Lower center of gravity, better weight distribution, modern chassis design. The fact that they eventually became more dangerous than gassers was due to the horsepower war that followed, not the fundamental design. But in 1966, NHRA could tell their insurance companies they'd eliminated the most dangerous class of cars. Premiums dropped. The sanctioning body survived. Some gassers found second lives in different ways. Many were converted to match race cars, traveling from track to track for appearance money rather than competing in organized classes. These exhibitions kept a few cars running through the early 70s, but it was life support, not living. The match race circuit was about nostalgia, not competition. Fans came to remember what was, not witness what could be. The restoration movement started almost immediately. By 1968, collectors were already buying up abandoned gassers, recognizing their historical importance. A car that couldn't win a race was suddenly worth preserving as art. The same 41 Willys that teams couldn't give away in 1967 were selling for premium prices by 1970 to collectors who'd never raced them again. Today, an authentic period gasser can sell for $100,000 to $250,000 at auction, more than they ever made racing. Stone, Woods, and Cook's restored Willys sold for $192,000 at Barrett-Jackson. These aren't race cars anymore. They're artifacts from when drag racing was pure, dangerous, and democratic, when anybody with a welder and more courage than sense could compete. The technical preservation is remarkable. Restorers hunt for period-correct GMC 671 blowers, vintage Hilburn fuel injection, original Hallebrand magnesium wheels. They study old photos to get the stance exactly right, 8 inches of front elevation, 4-degree positive caster, the specific rake that made gassers look like they were accelerating while standing still. It's archaeology, not restoration. Modern tribute gassers miss the point entirely. They use modern chassis, disc brakes, coil-over suspension, and electronic fuel injection hidden under vintage-looking velocity stacks. They're safer, faster, and more reliable than the originals. They're also soulless. A real gasser was barely controlled violence. These tributes are costume jewelry. They look the part but lack the danger that defined the originals. There's been a revival of sorts in nostalgia racing where period-correct gassers compete under 1960s rules. The Southeast Gassers Association runs events where straight axles are mandatory, wheel stands are encouraged, and modern safety equipment is cleverly hidden. But it's theater, not war. Everyone goes home. Nobody risks everything. The existential danger that made gassers compelling is gone, replaced by careful recreation. The participants know they're playing pretend. Randy Bradford, who races a recreation of the Ohio George 33 Willys, told me, "We're not trying to be what they were. We're honoring what they were. Those guys were crazy. We're just enthusiasts with good insurance." What really died in 1966 wasn't just a class of race cars. It was the last moment when drag racing belonged to the outcasts, the rebels, the guys who built impossible things in their garages. After funny cars took over, drag racing became corporate, professional, packaged. The wildness was managed, regulated, and eventually eliminated. Gassers represented something pure in American motorsport, the idea that with enough ingenuity and courage, anybody could be competitive. You didn't need factory backing or million-dollar budgets. You needed a pre-war body, a junkyard engine block, and the ability to make horsepower from thin air and determination. When NHRA changed the rules, they didn't just obsolete a type of car, they closed the door on racing's democratic era. The old-timers who lived through it still get angry talking about 1966. Tommy Evo, who ran both gassers and later funny cars, said, "Funny cars were never as pure as gassers. With a gasser, you were fighting the car every inch. It was personal. Funny cars were just equipment, fast equipment, but still just equipment." Doug Cookie Cook from Stone Woods and Cook was more philosophical. Everything ends. We had a hell of a run. Those years from 58 to 65, that was real drag racing. What came after was something else. Maybe better, maybe not, but definitely different. Tim Woods, the driver for Stone, Woods and Cook, put it most simply. Gassers were honest. What you saw was what you got. A big engine, a light car, and balls. Funny cars were illusions, fiberglass bodies pretending to be steel, chassis that had nothing to do with production cars, technology over courage. We went from building hot rods to building purpose-built race cars. Something was lost. The last competitive gasser pass at an NHRA national event was made by Johnny Loper in his BGS 48 Anglia at the 1972 Spring Nationals. He ran a 10.84 at 127 miles per hour and lost in the first round to a car running 990s. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. The crowd was watching funny cars in the other lane running 6-second passes at 230 miles per hour. The safety argument NHRA used was eventually proven hollow. By 1970, funny cars were experiencing catastrophic failures that made gasser wheel stands look tame. Bodies were lifting off at speed, creating airplane wings that launched cars into the air. Engines were exploding with such violence that blocks split in half. Fire became constant. Nitromethane burns invisible during the day, so drivers were literally on fire without knowing it. But the money was too good to go backward. Funny car match races were drawing 20,000 people. Television was interested. Sponsors were writing six-figure checks. The sport had graduated from rebellion to business, and business doesn't look backward. Don Garlitz, who revolutionized both gassers and later top fuel dragsters, had the most pragmatic take. Gassers had to die for drag racing to grow. They were beautiful, they were pure, and they were holding us back. You can't have a professional sport where cars are swapping lanes and doing backflips. NHRA made the right call, even if it broke a lot of hearts. The engineering legacy of gassers lived on in unexpected ways. The weight transfer principles they pioneered became fundamental to all drag racing. The ladder bar suspension they developed evolved into the four-link setups used today. Even the radical caster angles they ran influenced modern pro stock chassis tuning. Gassers were the laboratory where drag racing figured out how to go fast. Funny cars were just the commercialization of those lessons. There's a profound metaphor in how gassers died. They were killed by progress, by safety, by money, by the inevitable march toward professionalization. They represented an America that built things with its hands, that valued courage over calculation, that believed anybody could compete if they wanted it badly enough. That America was dying too, replaced by corporate efficiency and managed risk. Today, drag racing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Top fuel dragsters run 3.6-second passes at 330 miles per hour. The technology is staggering: million-dollar engines that live for 4 seconds, clutch management systems that apply 10,000 horsepower in staged increments, carbon fiber bodies that weigh less than the driver. It's spectacular. It's also completely inaccessible to anybody without massive corporate backing. You can't build a competitive top fuel car in your garage. You can't develop a funny car engine in your basement. Modern drag racing is F1 in a straight line. Brilliant engineering that normal people can watch, but never touch. Gassers were the opposite. They were attainable violence. They were democratic danger. They were the last moment when an average guy with above-average courage could compete at the highest level. The tragedy isn't that gassers disappeared, it's that nothing replaced what they represented. Modern sportsman classes try to recapture that accessibility, but they're neutered by safety regulations and spec rules. You can't innovate. You can't push boundaries. You can't build something genuinely dangerous and magnificent. You can only color within the lines NHRA draws for you. When people wonder why drag racing lost its cultural relevance, why it went from packed grandstands to empty aluminum bleachers, the answer starts in 1966. When NHRA killed gassers to make room for funny cars, they chose spectacle over participation. They chose corporate money over grassroots innovation. They chose progress over soul. They were probably right from a business perspective. They were definitely wrong from a spiritual one. Gassers disappeared from drag racing overnight because they were legislated into extinction by an industry that had outgrown its rebellious roots. They were too pure, too dangerous, and too democratic for the corporate future drag racing was racing toward. In killing them, NHRA killed the last vestige of the outlaw spirit that created drag racing in the first place. What survived was faster, safer, and more profitable. It was also sterile, inaccessible, and forgettable. The ghost of every gasser that got parked in 1966 haunts modern drag racing. They're reminders of when the sport belonged to the builders, not the buyers. When courage mattered more than cubic dollars. When anybody with a torch and a death wish could be a hero. That's not nostalgia talking. That's history, and history says we traded authenticity for artifice, and we're still paying the price. What's the most radical gasser you've ever seen, either in person or in old footage? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you want more stories about the machines and moments that defined American motorsports before everything got corporate and careful, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started on documenting what we lost when we chose progress over passion.